They called her worthless because she could never have children, but before the sun set that day, the most feared man in the city would make a decision that no one saw coming. Grace Carter stood perfectly still in the narrow hallway of the modest suburban house she had called home for nearly 20 years, her fingers tightening around the worn canvas tote bag hanging from her shoulder. The scent of burnt coffee drifted from the kitchen while an old wall clock ticked loudly enough to drown out the silence that had settled over the house since breakfast. Something felt wrong. Her adoptive mother had spent the entire morning avoiding her eyes, and her adoptive father had answered every question with clipped, impatient words. They had told her to come home early from her housekeeping job because an important family meeting couldn't wait. Grace had hoped, foolishly, that perhaps they wanted to apologize. 3 weeks had passed since her doctor gently explained that complications from a childhood illness had left her unable to carry a pregnancy. The news had broken something inside her, but it had shattered something even greater inside the people she had spent half her life sacrificing for. She had worked double shifts cleaning luxury apartments across Manhattan, skipped vacations, delayed college, and handed over nearly every paycheck so the family could keep their mortgage current and her younger adoptive brother could finish school. She never complained. She believed love was measured by sacrifice. Today she was about to learn that some people only measured value. The front door opened before anyone knocked. A sharply dressed man in an expensive charcoal coat stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, followed by another man carrying a leather folder. Neither smiled. Neither introduced himself. Grace looked toward her parents, expecting confusion, but instead she saw relief wash across their faces. Her adoptive mother quickly smoothed the wrinkles from her blouse, while her father forced the kind of grin reserved for strangers with money. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. The older visitor glanced at her briefly before opening the folder and sliding several papers across the dining table. No one asked Grace to sit. No one explained why her name appeared across the top page in bold letters. Her adoptive father picked up a pen with steady hands and signed without hesitation. Her mother followed seconds later. Grace's throat tightened. "What's happening?" she asked softly, searching each familiar face for an answer that never came. Her father finally looked at her, but there was no warmth left in his eyes. "You should be grateful," he said flatly. "Someone is still willing to give you a future." Grace blinked, unable to understand. "I already have a job. I can support myself." The man in the charcoal coat let out a quiet laugh that carried no humor. "This isn't about your job." Grace stared at the papers again, noticing legal language she couldn't fully process before one sentence pierced through the blur. Transfer of guardianship and financial compensation. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "You sold me," she whispered, almost afraid of the answer. Her adoptive mother's voice remained cold. "You can't give us grandchildren. We invested years raising you. It's time someone else took responsibility." The room seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet as every childhood memory suddenly felt like borrowed furniture inside a house that had never truly belonged to her. Outside, the low rumble of powerful engines echoed through the quiet neighborhood. One black luxury SUV rolled slowly to the curb, followed by another, then another, until an entire convoy stood silently in front of the house. Every conversation inside stopped. Even the two businessmen exchanged uneasy glances. Grace wiped away the tears she hadn't realized were falling as the lead vehicle's door opened, and a tall man in an impeccably tailored black suit stepped onto the sidewalk with calm, deliberate confidence. No one inside recognized him yet, but within minutes, every life in that house was about to change forever. Grace Carter could not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the line of black vehicles outside the small house, while every instinct told her that whoever had arrived carried a kind of authority that could not be questioned. The afternoon sunlight reflected across polished black paint, turning the quiet suburban street into a scene that felt strangely disconnected from the ordinary world she had known only minutes before. Inside, the confidence that had filled the room only seconds earlier quietly began to disappear. Her adoptive father cleared his throat and straightened his shirt, suddenly looking far less certain than the man who had signed away her future without hesitation. Grace barely noticed. Her mind had already drifted somewhere else, searching for answers buried years in the past. She remembered arriving at this house when she was only 8 years old, carrying a pink backpack with a broken zipper and a stuffed rabbit, missing one button eye. The social worker had smiled kindly and promised she had found a family that would love her forever. Grace believed every word. She spent the next 2 decades trying to earn a place she thought had already been given. Every birthday card she made by hand, every school award she proudly carried home, every holiday meal she cooked after learning recipes from library books, she believed they were building something called family. As she grew older, responsibility quietly replaced affection. By the time she turned 18, she worked weekends at a neighborhood diner. At 20, she cleaned offices after sunset. At 23, she accepted a housekeeping position in Manhattan where luxury apartments overlooked Central Park, spending nearly 3 hours each day commuting by train because the pay was better. Every Friday evening, she placed almost her entire paycheck into her adoptive father's hands before keeping just enough for a monthly subway pass and simple groceries. Whenever friends invited her to dinner, she politely declined, saying she was saving money for the future. The truth was she believed helping her family was her future. When the roof leaked, she paid the contractor. When her adoptive brother wanted a newer pickup truck before graduating college, she quietly covered the down payment. When medical bills arrived after her adoptive mother's surgery, Grace accepted extra cleaning shifts without complaining. She convinced herself that love was not measured by words, but by sacrifice. Yet slowly, she noticed something she tried desperately to ignore. Gratitude became expectation. Kindness became obligation. No matter how much she gave, there was always another bill, another request, another reminder that she should be thankful they had taken her in all those years ago. Then came the doctor's appointment that changed everything. Grace had walked into the specialist's office believing she simply needed routine testing after months of unexplained discomfort. Instead, the physician spoke gently, explaining that complications from an illness she barely remembered surviving as a child had permanently damaged her reproductive system. The doctor assured her she could still live a full and meaningful life, but Grace barely heard the rest. She drove home in silence, rehearsing how she would tell the only family she had ever known. She expected comfort. Instead, the questions came immediately. Could the doctors be wrong? Would another hospital say something different? How would any husband ever accept that? Within days, conversation stopped. Smiles disappeared. Her place at the dinner table suddenly felt temporary. Looking back now, standing only a few feet from the papers that had erased her place in the household, Grace realized the diagnosis had not changed who she was. It had only revealed who everyone else had been all along. Outside, the tall stranger closed the door of the lead vehicle with calm precision and began walking toward the front porch as if every step had already been decided long before anyone inside that house picked up a pen. The knock on the front door echoed through the house with calm precision, not loud enough to startle anyone, yet impossible to ignore. No one moved for several seconds. The two businessmen who had arrived to complete the paperwork exchanged uncertain glances before one quietly closed the leather folder. Whatever confidence they had carried into the house was fading with every passing second. Grace remained where she stood, her breathing shallow, her heart refusing to settle. She had no idea who the man outside was, but she could sense that everyone else suddenly wished. They did. Her adoptive father forced another smile, wiping invisible dust from the dining table before opening the door. Standing on the porch was a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit, his posture effortless, his expression unreadable. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his calm gray eyes swept across the room with remarkable patience, noticing every face before resting briefly on Grace. He did not introduce himself immediately. Instead, he offered a polite nod that somehow carried more authority than raised voices ever could. Behind him, several professionally dressed men remained beside the vehicles without speaking, their disciplined stillness making the quiet neighborhood feel even quieter. "Good afternoon," the stranger said in a measured American accent touched by the faintest trace of Korean influence. "I believe an agreement was signed here today." Grace's adoptive father swallowed before answering. Everything has already been handled. The visitor glanced toward the documents, still lying on the dining table. Has it? His voice never became louder, yet every word landed with unexpected weight. One of the businessmen stepped forward nervously. Sir, this is a private family matter. The stranger slowly shifted his attention toward him. A family matter usually begins with a person whose future is being decided. His eyes returned to Grace. Were you asked to sign anything? Grace blinked in surprise. It was the first time anyone in the room had asked what she wanted. She lowered her eyes toward the papers and quietly shook her head.
No.
The single word settled over the room like heavy rain. Her adoptive mother hurried to interrupt. She has always trusted us to make decisions for her. The stranger remained silent for a moment, studying Grace rather than her parents. He noticed the faded sleeves of her housekeeping uniform, the worn sneakers that had been repaired more than once, and the tired eyes of someone who had carried responsibilities far beyond her years. There was no bitterness in her expression, only quiet exhaustion. It was a look he recognized all too well. He had built an empire by understanding people long before they spoke. One of his associates approached from the driveway and handed him a slim tablet. The stranger read several lines without changing expression. Then he looked once more at Grace's adoptive father. Interesting, he said calmly. According to these financial records, nearly 68% of this household's income over the past 5 years came from Miss Grace Carter. The room fell completely silent. Grace slowly turned toward the people she had called family, disbelief replacing confusion. She had never calculated the numbers herself. She had simply worked harder every year because she believed they needed her. The stranger continued in the same steady tone. Mortgage payments, utility bills, vehicle financing, medical expenses, tuition assistance, all connected to her earnings. Grace's adoptive brother looked away without saying a word. Her adoptive mother folded her arms defensively. Her father attempted another explanation, but no words came. For the first time in years, Grace saw uncertainty replace certainty in his eyes. The stranger closed the tablet and spoke only one quiet sentence. People who carry a family should never be treated as if they were disposable. Grace felt something unfamiliar rise inside her. Not hope, not yet, but the fragile realization that somewhere beyond the walls of this house, there might still be someone capable of seeing her true worth. The stranger allowed the silence to linger, as though he understood that truth often carried greater weight when no one rushed to explain it away. Grace stood motionless beside the dining table, her fingers trembling slightly against the strap of her faded canvas bag. For the first time in years, someone had spoken about her sacrifices as if they actually mattered. She was not sure how to respond. Gratitude felt unfamiliar after so many years of being reminded that she owed everything to the people who had raised her. Her adoptive father finally forced a dry laugh that convinced no one. "You have the wrong impression," he said. "We only wanted what was best for her. She needs stability. Someone willing to provide for her future." The visitor regarded him with calm curiosity. "Does she know the person you selected?" "That is not important," her adoptive mother answered quickly. "She should appreciate that someone is still willing to accept her circumstances." Grace lowered her eyes. Those words had become painfully familiar during the past 3 weeks. Friends of the family had stopped calling. Neighbors who once greeted her warmly suddenly looked at her with quiet sympathy. Every conversation somehow returned to the same question of what kind of future a woman could expect after receiving such devastating medical news. Yet no one had asked about her dreams, her work, or the kindness she had spent years giving away without expecting anything in return. The stranger slowly walked farther into the living room, his polished shoes making almost no sound across the hardwood floor. His attention settled on a framed photograph resting above the fireplace. Grace recognized it immediately. It had been taken nearly 10 years earlier at her adoptive brother's high school graduation. Everyone in the picture smiled proudly. Grace remembered taking a second bus after finishing an overnight cleaning shift just so she could attend the ceremony without anyone knowing how exhausted she truly was. She also noticed something else. She was standing at the edge of the photograph, almost outside the frame, as though she had always belonged, just close enough to help but never close enough to truly belong. "Interesting placement," the visitor said quietly. No one answered. One of the associates standing near the front door stepped forward and spoke in a respectful tone. "Sir, the board members are waiting for your arrival downtown. They have delayed the meeting twice." The man nodded without taking his eyes off the photograph. "They can wait a little longer." Grace looked at him in surprise. Whoever he was, important people were clearly waiting for him, yet he remained inside the modest home of a woman he had never met. That realization only deepened the mystery surrounding him. Her adoptive father attempted to recover control of the conversation. "May I ask who you are?" The stranger finally turned around. His expression remained composed, almost thoughtful. "My name is Ethan Romano." The name settled over the room with immediate effect. One of the businessmen inhaled sharply. The other quietly stepped backward. Grace noticed the sudden change, but could not understand it. The name meant nothing to her. She had spent nearly every waking hour working, not following headlines or business magazines. Her adoptive father, however, had turned noticeably pale. His voice faltered before he managed to speak. You are the Romano?" Ethan offered only a small nod. Among other responsibilities. He did not elaborate, nor did he need to. The uncertainty in everyone else's faces explained more than any introduction could. Ethan looked back toward Grace. Unlike the others, she showed no fear, no fascination, and no attempt to impress him. She simply looked confused and emotionally drained. That honesty caught his attention more than any carefully chosen words ever could. After a long moment, he asked her a question so simple that it surprised everyone in the room. "Miss Carter, if no one else decided your future today, where would you choose to go?" Grace opened her mouth, but no words came. She had spent so many years allowing other people to decide what she should do, where she should work, how much she should give, that the simple question felt almost impossible to answer. Ethan Romano did not interrupt her silence. He simply waited with the same quiet patience that had unsettled everyone else in the room. Outside, the neighborhood remained unusually still. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the open doorway, while curious neighbors watched discreetly from behind curtains, wondering why a line of luxury vehicles had stopped in front of the modest home. Grace finally lowered her eyes and spoke so softly that everyone leaned forward to hear. "I would find a small apartment somewhere close to the train. I would keep cleaning houses because I am good at it. I would save enough money to take classes at night. I always wanted to study interior design." The confession surprised even her. She had not spoken those dreams aloud in years. Her adoptive mother let out a dismissive sigh. "Dreams do not pay bills." Grace flinched slightly, almost out of habit, but Ethan noticed something different this time. She did not apologize. She simply stood quietly, accepting neither approval nor criticism. One of Ethan's associates received a phone call and stepped outside for a brief conversation. Moments later he returned, leaning toward Ethan and speaking in a voice only loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Sir, the background report is complete." Ethan accepted a thin folder without opening it immediately. Instead, he asked another question. "Miss Carter, have you ever been arrested?" Grace looked genuinely surprised.
"No."
"Any civil lawsuits?" "Never." "Outstanding debts?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "Only a small student loan that I have almost finished paying." Ethan nodded once before opening the report. Every page confirmed what his investigators had discovered within the past hour. Grace Carter had worked continuously since she was 16 years old. Every employer described her the same way: dependable, honest, compassionate. She had returned expensive jewelry left behind by clients without being asked. She had once found several $1,000s hidden inside an old jacket while cleaning a penthouse apartment and immediately contacted the owner instead of keeping it. Another report described how she quietly organized meal deliveries for an elderly neighbor recovering from surgery, never telling anyone she was the person paying for them. Ethan closed the folder slowly. Very few people remained consistent when no one was watching. Grace had done exactly that for years. His attention shifted toward the dining table, where the unsigned copies of the transfer agreement still rested. "Who prepared these documents?" he asked calmly. One of the businessmen nervously raised his hand. "They were requested by the family." Ethan studied him for several seconds. "Did you ever ask Miss Carter whether she agreed to any of this?" The man looked down. "No, sir." Ethan nodded thoughtfully, showing neither anger nor satisfaction. "Then they are incomplete." Grace stared at him, confused. Her adoptive father stepped forward with growing frustration. "You have no legal reason to interfere." Ethan's expression remained unchanged. Perhaps not. He paused long enough for every eye in the room to settle on him. "But I always have a reason to stop someone from being treated like property." Grace felt tears gathering again, yet this time they came from somewhere entirely different. For years she had believed kindness made people invisible. Standing only a few feet away, Ethan Romano was proving that the right person could see what everyone else had chosen to ignore. No one spoke after Ethan Romano's final words. Even the quiet ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than before. Grace looked around the room that had once represented safety, and for the first time, she realized it no longer felt like home. The faded curtains she had washed every spring, the dining table she had refinished with her own hands, and the family photographs she had carefully dusted every Saturday suddenly looked like pieces of someone else's life. She wondered how many years she had confused responsibility with belonging. Her adoptive mother finally broke the silence. "You are making this far more dramatic than it needs to be. She has nowhere else to go." Ethan turned toward Grace instead of answering. "Is that true?" Grace hesitated. The truthful answer was painful. "I do not have much saved. Most of my earnings went to the household. But I can work. I always find work." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly, as though that response confirmed something he had already suspected. People who believed in their own ability to rebuild rarely stayed defeated for long. One of his associates quietly approached with another folder. "Sir, we completed the additional review." Ethan accepted it and scanned only the first page before closing it again. He did not need to read every detail. The report confirmed that Grace had never missed a scheduled day of work in nearly 10 years. Former employers described her as trustworthy, respectful, and remarkably calm under pressure. Several clients specifically requested her by name because they trusted her inside their homes without hesitation. One elderly couple had even written a personal letter thanking her for visiting them on weekends after her employment contract had ended, refusing payment because, as Grace had explained, loneliness should never come with a bill. Ethan slowly looked up from the report. His organization employed hundreds of people across legitimate businesses throughout New York. Skills could be taught. Loyalty could sometimes be purchased. Character was far more difficult to find. Grace possessed the one quality that every powerful leader quietly searched for but rarely discovered. She remained kind even when life had given her every excuse not to be. Her adoptive father folded his arms. "You have learned enough about her. If you are not involved in this agreement, then there is no reason for you to stay." Ethan smiled politely, although it never reached his eyes. "Actually, I came because one of my companies was asked to facilitate a financial transfer connected to these documents." The room froze once again. The businessmen stared at him in disbelief. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. "Certain transactions pass through financial institutions that my organization monitors for compliance. Large payments involving unusual legal arrangements receive additional review. That is how your paperwork found its way to my desk this morning." Grace slowly looked toward the unsigned documents. She had assumed they were created quietly by strangers. She never imagined that a routine financial review would place someone like Ethan Romano at her doorstep. Fate often arrived through ordinary moments that no one recognized until much later. Ethan handed the folder back to his associate. "The transfer has been suspended." One of the businessmen immediately protested. "Sir, the clients are expecting confirmation before 5 o'clock. Ethan glanced at the elegant watch on his wrist. "Then they will receive a different confirmation." His tone remained courteous, but there was unmistakable finality beneath every word. Grace noticed that no one argued further. Whatever authority Ethan possessed extended far beyond the walls of this small house. She still did not fully understand who he was, but she understood one thing with perfect clarity. Every person in the room who had ignored her voice moments earlier now waited quietly for his. Ethan finally met Grace's eyes once more. "Miss Carter," he said gently, "before anyone discusses your future again, I believe it is time someone asked what kind of life you deserve instead of what kind of life other people expect you to accept." Grace had never imagined that a single afternoon could erase years of certainty. She looked around the living room one more time, expecting someone to tell her this had all been a misunderstanding. No apology came. Her adoptive father avoided her eyes. Her adoptive mother busied herself stacking papers that no longer carried any authority. Even her adoptive brother remained silent, staring at the hardwood floor that Grace herself had refinished the previous summer. The silence hurt more than angry words ever could. Ethan Romano understood that kind of silence. It was the sound people made when truth finally removed every excuse. He turned toward one of his senior associates, a composed, middle-aged man named Daniel Kim, who immediately stepped forward with a small leather notebook already open. "Daniel," Ethan said evenly, "contact legal affairs. I want every document involving Miss Carter reviewed before sunset. Any agreement signed without her informed consent is to remain suspended until further notice." Daniel nodded once. "Yes, sir." Ethan continued without raising his voice. "Verify property records, financial transfers, employment history, and any contracts connected to her name during the past 10 years. I want accuracy, not assumptions." "Understood." Grace listened in quiet disbelief. No one had ever investigated her life because they believed she deserved protection. Most people only noticed her when they needed something cleaned, organized, or repaired. Yet this stranger was assigning an entire team simply to understand what had happened to her. She did not know whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed. Ethan noticed the uncertainty in her expression. "Do not misunderstand," he said gently. "I do not make decisions based on sympathy. I make them based on facts." Grace slowly nodded. Somehow that answer comforted her even more. Sympathy faded. Facts remained. A soft vibration interrupted the silence as Daniel glanced at his phone. "Sir, preliminary reports are already coming in." Ethan accepted the device and quietly reviewed several messages. Every update pointed in the same direction. Grace had never withdrawn unusually large amounts of money for herself. Her savings account contained less than $6,000 despite years of steady employment. Payroll deposits consistently matched transfers into household accounts controlled by her adoptive parents. There was no evidence of financial irresponsibility, only years of quiet sacrifice. Ethan looked toward Grace again. "Did you ever expect repayment?" She shook her head. "They were my family. I believed helping them was the right thing to do." Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. Kindness should never become permission for exploitation. Those words settled deeply inside Grace. She realized she had spent years confusing generosity with obligation because she feared losing the only family she had ever known. Outside, another vehicle quietly entered the street before stopping behind the convoy. A well-dressed woman carrying a slim briefcase stepped out and walked confidently toward the house. Daniel opened the front door before she reached it. "Sir, our legal counsel has arrived." Within moments, she entered the living room, greeted Ethan respectfully, and placed several folders onto the dining table where the earlier documents had remained untouched. She quickly reviewed the paperwork before looking up. "Based on what I have seen so far, Miss Carter's consent appears to be entirely absent. Nothing here should move forward." Grace's adoptive father finally protested. "You cannot simply take over our family matters." The attorney calmly closed the folder. This stopped being only a family matter the moment legal rights and financial compensation became connected without the direct participation of the individual involved. Ethan remained completely composed. He glanced once toward Grace before giving his final instruction for the day. "From this moment forward, no one will negotiate her future without first hearing her voice. That is not a request. It is the standard everyone in my organization follows, and today it will begin here as well." Grace looked at the stack of legal folders spread across the dining table, then slowly at the faces surrounding her. For years she had believed that escaping this house would mean walking away with nothing. Now she understood that leaving with her dignity might be worth more than anything she had ever tried to protect. Even so, uncertainty settled heavily in her chest. She had no apartment waiting, no relatives she could call, and no clear picture of tomorrow. Ethan Romano seemed to recognize every question she had not spoken aloud. He buttoned his suit jacket with the same calm precision that marked every movement he made before speaking in a steady voice. "Miss Carter, I have no intention of deciding your future for you, but I can offer you an opportunity that comes with one condition." Grace looked up carefully. "What condition?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "That every decision after today belongs to you." The simplicity of the answer caught her off guard. She had expected complicated contracts or obligations. Instead, he offered something she had not possessed in years. Choice. Daniel Kim quietly stepped forward and handed Grace a simple cream-colored business card. She accepted it with trembling fingers. The card carried only a name, a Manhattan address, and a direct telephone number. There were no flashy titles or impressive descriptions. Ethan noticed her curiosity. "One of my companies manages several residential properties and hospitality services throughout the city. We are always looking for people whose character is stronger than their resume." Grace blinked. "You are offering me a job?" "I am offering you an interview," Ethan corrected gently. "The position must still be earned. I do not lower standards for anyone." Surprisingly, that made Grace smile for the first time that day. It was small and uncertain, but genuine. She had never wanted special treatment. She had only wanted a fair chance. Ethan noticed the faint change in her expression and silently concluded that hope often returned in the smallest forms. His legal counsel carefully gathered the suspended documents and placed them into a secure case. "These will remain under review until every legal question has been resolved," she explained calmly. Grace's adoptive father took one frustrated step forward before stopping himself. He seemed ready to argue again, but every excuse now sounded weaker than the truth already sitting on the table. Her adoptive mother looked away toward the kitchen window, unable to meet Grace's eyes. For the first time in many years, no one asked Grace to stay, no one apologized, and no one thanked her for everything she had given. Their silence became the answer she had spent years waiting to hear.
Grace slowly set her worn canvas bag over her shoulder.
It contained little more than a spare sweater, a notebook, and the lunch container she carried to work every morning. 20 years of devotion had somehow become small enough to fit inside one bag. Ethan walked toward the front door before pausing beside her. "You do not have to decide today," he said. "My offer will still be waiting tomorrow." Grace looked once more around the modest living room, allowing herself one final glance at the place where she had spent so much of her life trying to earn love that had never truly been offered. Then she quietly nodded. "I think I already know my answer." Ethan opened the front door, and warm afternoon sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Outside, the row of black vehicles remained waiting in complete silence, not as symbols of power, but as an unexpected doorway leading toward a future that Grace had never dared to imagine for herself. Grace stepped across the doorway without looking back. The afternoon air felt strangely different, lighter somehow, as though every breath carried possibilities instead of obligations. The front lawn stretched toward the quiet street, where the line of black luxury vehicles remained perfectly still beneath the golden sunlight. Curious neighbors continued watching from their porches and windows, whispering to one another, trying to understand why the woman they had seen leaving for work before sunrise every morning was now walking beside a man whose presence seemed to command respect without demanding it. Grace tightened her grip on the canvas bag resting against her shoulder. It was the only thing she owned that truly belonged to her. Ethan Romano paused beside the lead vehicle instead of opening the door immediately. He looked toward Grace with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. "Before you decide anything else," he said quietly, "there is something you deserve to know." Grace nodded, uncertain what could possibly surprise her after everything that had happened. Ethan glanced briefly toward Daniel Kim, who handed him a slim folder sealed with a simple black band. Ethan removed a single page and offered it to Grace. "These are employment records from one of my hospitality companies." Grace accepted the document carefully. Her eyes moved across the page until they reached a familiar address in Midtown Manhattan. She froze. It was the luxury apartment building where she had worked as a housekeeper for nearly 4 years. Ethan noticed the surprise in her face. "You have been working for one of my companies longer than either of us realized." Grace looked up in disbelief. I clean those apartments almost every day." Ethan nodded. "Our management team regularly receives performance reports from supervisors. Your name appeared more often than anyone else's." Grace blinked in confusion. "I never met the owner."
No, isn't displayed.
"But I have read every recommendation they submitted about you." Daniel quietly handed Grace another page. Each line described the same qualities she had carried through life, without expecting anyone to notice. Honest, dependable, patient, trusted by residents, willingly assisted elderly tenants after working hours, never accepted gifts that violated company policy. Grace felt tears filling her eyes once again, but this time they were no longer born from rejection. Someone had seen her long before today. Ethan spoke softly. "I did not come here because I felt sorry for you. I came because every report described the same person. Someone who quietly improved the lives of others without asking for recognition." Grace lowered the paper slowly. Years of invisible kindness had somehow reached someone she had never met. She suddenly realized that character often traveled farther than reputation. Ethan opened the rear passenger door of the vehicle. "There is a furnished apartment available through our employee housing program. It is yours for as long as you need while you decide what comes next. No contracts beyond ordinary employment policies. No hidden conditions. Simply a place where you can begin again." Grace looked back one final time at the small house behind her. No one had followed her outside. The front door remained half open, but the people inside stayed exactly where they were, watching silently as the woman who had carried their burdens for so many years quietly walked away carrying only her own future. She turned back toward Ethan and smiled through tears that no longer felt heavy. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan gave a respectful nod before closing the folder in his hands. "Do not thank me yet, Miss Carter. Build the life you wanted. Then thank yourself." As Grace stepped into the waiting vehicle, she still believed she had simply accepted an unexpected job offer from a remarkably influential businessman. She had no idea that the quiet man who had chosen to protect her that afternoon was the leader of one of the most powerful Korean organizations in the country, and she knew even less that this ordinary decision would become the beginning of a life neither of them could yet imagine.